Well, good morning and welcome to the Hangout with the Speakers Director. I'm delighted to be sharing some time with you today. The reason for creating this was that I've got a couple of events coming up. I'm also launching a new online speaking program. And I thought, well, before I kicked off with all of that, I might share a little bit about story and a bit about speaking, how you can create better presentations, how you can be a better speaker, how you can launch a product, lots of different things that people ask me about all the time. But I thought it might be more fun to actually do this in company with other people, which is why I created the Hangout. So I hope you've brought your questions with you. I have had a couple of questions from people who haven't been able to attend in person on the call, and I will answer those to the best of my ability. I've got them on my list here, and I'll get to those in a minute. So let's just talk a little bit about Speaking Alchemy. So I've created a new program called Speaking Alchemy, and as part of this Hangout, I'm sharing with you a taster of that online program. The online program will be launching at the end of October, and the freebie course, which is a series of half a dozen little mini lessons, I suppose, for want of a better word. I'm launching that pretty much straight after the webinar. Well, in fact, it will be tomorrow because the it's just going to take me a little time to actually get it all loaded up. Now, most of it's there already, and I'll be able to share with you the link, and I'll be sending that to you as a personal invitation to be the very first to try it out. So I hope you are looking forward to finding out a little bit more about that. Sorry, I have something in my eye, so that's cool. So the purpose of creating that was that I've always been asked very similar questions, like at the beginning of someone's speaking journey, and it doesn't matter whether they're speaking for their business or it's to be able to be a better networker. For most people, there's going to be some kind of an interface where they might get a bit nervous about speaking in public. So I always get asked very similar questions at the start of any coaching relationship around how to do things like that better. So that was one of the reasons I decided that I would create that online. I just felt that there is such a need out there now for people to be able to communicate better. You know, in this information age, in this technology age, we've become so reliant on our digital connections with people that we find it quite a struggle to be able to talk with people face to face. But we are in the connection economy. We're out there. We are looking for ways to connect with people that have meaning, that matter. And that's why I've created not only the programs that I'm creating, but also why I do what I do. Because for me, it's about changing the world one conversation at a time. And because I want this to be a conversation, I would love to be able to chat with you live about any questions that you might have. The purpose of this is a hangout. It's not a webinar. I'm not going to be instructing you. Hopefully I'll be able to provide through the questions some information that's really helpful to you. So please feel free. I'm going to open the chat. Feel free to ask your questions in the chat, and I will then talk to those questions. And if you're able to unmute yourself, that would be fantastic as well. So, Deb's got a question about public speaking. My brain goes into a meltdown and freezes when asked to speak off the cuff. Also, when talking about something emotional, I tear up and cry, and this makes people uncomfortable. Thank you so much for sharing, Deb. Two really important points. Okay, so the first one, when your brain goes into meltdown, what often happens is that, and it's so funny because I did a webinar last night and I shared this particular technique on the webinar, so I'll share it with you again right now. When we're asked to speak off the cuff, we immediately go into judgment. When our brain freezes, it's because we've judged ourselves. We judge ourselves as not coping. We judge ourselves as not being able to do what we've been asked to do. So what happens, the minute we judge ourselves, that becomes the limit of what we're capable of. So if we judge ourselves as being a poor off-the-cuff speaker, or we judge ourselves as not having enough information to talk to people about, or that we don't know what we're saying, or that we're going to look foolish, any number of things. And I'm sure that this would resonate for all of you. When that happens, well, then what we create is like a very, very narrow world for ourselves. So what I suggest to people is that instead of making it the spotlight being on you, that you turn the spotlight around and you shine it on your audience. The minute you take that spotlight off yourself, you take the pressure off yourself, because really that's all you're doing. When your brain freezes, it's just that you've put so much pressure on yourself that it's like, the whole deer in the headlights thing. It's fight or flight. So you're immediately hijacked, if you like, by that fight or flight response, and there's kind of nothing left. There's either I run away, or okay, if I'm going to fight, what do I need to do? Sometimes the adrenaline kicks in and you're okay, and you can kind of get going with what you want to speak on. However, what I recommend is that if you can imagine that, this is my hand here is the spotlight. If you can imagine that at the moment when somebody says, oh, can you speak, about this, and you're going, no, I can't really do that. If you instead turn the spotlight onto your audience and think, so what would be of most value for this audience to hear? Just ask yourself a what question. What could I say right now that would really help my audience? And you will find that words will show up. If you ask yourself a what question, not a how, because how goes into judgment, how on earth am I going to do that? And if you ask, so what could I say right now that would be really helpful to my audience? Or what could I share right now that my audience would find interesting? The minute you ask yourself that kind of a question, can you feel the difference in the energy there? Can you feel how that expands? Instead of limiting you to, I don't know what to say. Because when you do that intake of breath, and you kind of hold your breath and your shoulders go up and you get really frightened and you worry about how you're going to look, it's as if like all of your audience do the same with you. They pretty much go into empathy with you straight away. They all hold their breath and they're all waiting for you to say something. So the best way to release that is to, maybe you can share a quick joke, ask a question. Asking a question of an audience is often a really great way to just break the ice a little. Sometimes it's not appropriate, so you're just going to ask yourself, so what could I share that would be really helpful to this audience? Or what is one little piece of information that I could talk about right now? And that's where understanding your story comes in so very handy, because when you understand your story, you always have at least one or two little bits that you can share with someone. So, for instance, this webinar I did last night, now I didn't know I was actually going to be running the webinar at all. I thought I was just hopping onto their regular Monday night webinar to just have a listen and have a quick chat and tell them a little bit about my event in Sydney. And instead, it turned out that I was running the entire webinar. Now, I only really worked that out about half an hour before the webinar was running. So I had to quickly scribble down a few notes about, I asked myself the question, what's the most important thing for me to share with this audience? What would they get most value out of? And I always have lots of notes around, so I was able to kind of grab a few pieces and just work with that. And it went so well because I just kept speaking off the cuff. But I know my subject matter really well. So Deb, that might be the thing. When somebody asks you to speak off the cuff, generally it'll be about something that you're a subject matter expert in, even if you don't feel like you're a subject matter expert. People generally wouldn't ask you to speak about something off the cuff unless they believe that you've got the potential to and have the information to share that would be interesting to their audience. So does that help?
I think that's brilliant.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sharon.
And I think too, could you not ask yourself that if you were asked suddenly to write something for somebody, or any kind of sort of unexpected, unplanned sort of situation where you had to contribute in a creative way?
Yes, it works in any kind of situation where essentially you're put on the spot and someone says, oh, could you do this? And yes, absolutely, for writing, definitely, because if you just sit there in the space and say, okay, am I writing with this person's voice? Am I writing in my own voice? we all have our own voice. So sometimes when we're asked to write something for somebody else, we have to write in their voice, or we write in our voice. But if you're writing in your voice, then you just ask, well, what information do I have about this that would be really useful for me to share? Or what could notice how many what questions I'm using here. And we use this in coaching all the time, that we almost always ask nothing but what questions, unless we want a specific yes or no answer. So what could what is a different take on this particular subject that I could provide that maybe nobody else has thought of? And that's where, that wonderful creative, intuitive capacity can come in, so that you can look at something and think, oh, wow, yeah, that's really interesting information, but what could I bring to this discussion that might be a slightly different point of view? It's not about whether it agrees or not, or doesn't agree, but a different point of view for people to be able to chew over.
Brilliant.
And so hopefully that helps for that first part of your question, Deb. So part 2 of your question, which is when you're talking about something emotional. Okay, so what happens? And I've demonstrated this in person, and again, I spoke about it briefly last night, which is really interesting that it's coming up again. It's obviously something that people really need to know how to manage. As you know, and if you're listening to this call sometime in the future, I work a lot with people and their personal story, and often that can create great emotional impact as they're telling me the story. So invariably, the first time people tell me their story, and the second time, and the third time, and the fourth time, and the fifth time, and times and times and times again, they will tear up when they tell me their story. And what I recommend in those circumstances is to actually look at the story, and depending what the story is, maybe sometimes it works to write it down and look at it with a little bit more dispassionately, I suppose. But if you can write it down, then it allows you to look at it with a little bit more like one step removed. So if you can write it down first, and then once it's kind of out of your system, it's a little easier to deal with. The other technique that you do in conjunction with that is, if you can imagine, like, all of our stories are dynamic, right? They're in the past. Unless they're happening to you right at this moment in time and you're talking about it right there and then, most of our stories are in the past. But our stories are dynamic. They move, they shift, they change. They are constantly evolving. So when you tell your story, what happens, and you'll know this, Deb, from being an actor yourself, is that when you tell the story, you're telling it in the past tense. So what happens is that emotionally you go right back to that moment when it happened. And what happens is that you stay there. You don't actually bring your story into the present. So what I always recommend for people I'm working with, speakers, coaches, anybody who's working with personal story, wants to be able to share the story from the platform, is that instead of you revisiting the energy of the story in the past, you invite the energy of the story to come into the present. Does that make sense? I just got goosebumps when I said that, so I think that was important. Okay, so if you can you feel the energy of the difference of, instead of you going backwards to visit the story and essentially getting caught up in the emotion and the drama and the trauma of the story, and therefore being overwhelmed by the emotion, instead you invite the story to come and visit you in the present. You are still alive and present with the story, but it doesn't have the power to hijack you. It doesn't have the power to overwhelm you. You might still feel the emotion, but you can control it. You can control your voice, and you can control the tears. Because, as we say in the theatre, if you cry, your audience don't. And if you want to create impact for your audience, it's more important that they see you managing that story rather than being overwhelmed by it. Because when you're overwhelmed by it, it's exactly as you said, your audience get uncomfortable. They want to come and rescue you, and they can't. So be in service to your audience by bringing your story to the present and ensuring that you tell the story from the present day rather than allow yourself to go backwards into the energy of the story in the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit, Deb, it's a bit more than practicing mindfulness. It's not actually, certainly, it's about being present. Because when you go backwards with your story, you're no longer present with the audience. You're actually back in the past. So you're not actually being present. So in some respects, yes, it is about mindfulness, but it's more to do with actually being present with your audience right there and then, and bringing the energy of that story through to the present. So inviting the story into right now so that you can share it, rather than you energetically going backwards. Because when you go backwards, you get trapped in it. And you sit in that and you wallow in the emotion and you can't get out. Now, that might not be your intent to wallow and sit in the emotion, but it is what you do. So you need to leave the story where it is and just bring the energy of the story and the words of the story to the present.
So, Simone, for me, if I was, because, you know, we've talked about my mum before and the impact that had on me. So rather than me going back to the 41-year-old woman, newly birthed mother, blah, 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 that I was then, I sit here and go, okay, here I am, the nearly 54-year-old woman, who I am now, telling that story, sort of, rather than traveling back to being that person.
Yes.
I stay exactly where I am now and who I am now.
Yes.
But just kind of do it as if I'm reading it from a book.
Yes. It is a chapter in your book. It's like, you know, you've gone to the library of all of your stories and you've gone, here's the 41-year-old story. New mum and relationship with my mum, and you bring that, but you tell the story as if it's now. So depending on how you want to frame it for your audience and the purpose of why you want to share it with your audience as well. You know, it's really important to understand why you're sharing the story in the first place. So yes, so you tell it from who you are now, because you're not the 41-year-old. And, you know, it happens all the time with clients who have really significant stories. You know, their story starts at 2 years old when something really traumatic and dramatic happened. And so they're a 2-year-old and they respond from the 2-year-old energy where they had no power, they had no control, they had no words to explain this. Now, at whatever age they are now, and they can look back, they can bring the energy of that with them. But they don't need to go back to being a 2-year-old who has no power and no control over herself or her future, and is at the mercy of everybody else. Because if you tell your story from present day, and you can plot this out on the stage depending on how you want to tell the story. So you can start the story physically in the past, but you are not energetically in the past. There's a big difference between that. So I hope that makes, I hope that I've helped unpack that a little bit for you as well, Deb.
That's made a bit more sense to me.
Yeah. And also, you know, when we cry about our story, that's for us. Just be really clear about that. When we cry, when we tell a story and we cry, that's for us. That's for us to heal. We don't necessarily, and don't confuse that with trying not to be vulnerable. That's not what I'm talking about. But often when we allow ourselves to sit in that, that's purely and solely for us, because we feel that we need to do it right there and then. But, you know, that's not always going to be effective for your audience. It's not always going to be appropriate for the environment you find yourself in as well. So just understanding that difference, that when we are overcome, well, I'm talking about when we're absolutely overcome and hijacked by the emotion, that it becomes uncomfortable for our audience, then you know that you're being indulgent. So there's a difference there. So any other questions? Okay, nothing from the room at the moment. So I might just talk about one of the questions I was sent. And this is for Kate, asked me about how do you make metaphors stick? Now, a lot of people don't necessarily even understand what a metaphor is, so I'll just explain that a little bit first. And I had to go and look up Wikipedia to get the correct explanation and definition of it. So if you Wikipedia metaphor, it gives you a really good example of it there. And the one that I actually really like to use, funnily enough, is also the one that's on Wikipedia. So metaphor is when you say something to reference and you use it as almost like a resource, if you like, to reference something that will aid your audience's learning. A really great metaphor is all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their entrances and their exits. So that's a really well-known piece of Shakespeare's. And so we talk about all the world's a stage. So we then use one word to reference something else to help shape the story in our audience's mind. So the metaphor there is that really we all come and go on this stage that we call the world, and that we all interact with each other with our entrances and exits, and it's really just a play. The play is the thing. There's Shakespeare's fantastic for metaphors. There's so much that the way he writes that is based in metaphor, and so it helps your audience connect to your story in a slightly different way. And brains love stories. Our brains absolutely love stories, which is why they're so important, and why I've been doing so much talking about story in the last couple of weeks. So it's obviously on the rise that people are becoming more and more connected to each other through story. So how you can use metaphor, and Sharon, I know that you and I have done a little bit of work on this, is that if you have a significant story that you want to share, maybe it was a turning point in your life, maybe it was a bigger, some kind of a big event. Generally, the stories that work best to use a metaphor will be one that's a turning point, where you've had an aha moment about something, where you've gone, this is what I want to do. So for me, one of my turning points was when I was 20. I went to New York for the very first time. I visited America. My brother was living over there, and I went to visit him with my mum. And he took us to New York for the day. And as a treat, he took us to see our very first Broadway production. I can still remember the feeling. It was at the Schubert Theatre. And when I was in New York recently, I went back and visited again and went, oh my God, this is where I was standing when I had that moment, that turning point. I saw a chorus line, and and it was like Shakespeare's All the World's a Stage come to life for me. There was and I looked at that, and I walked out of that theatre just floating on air, and I remember thinking to myself, that is what I want to do the rest of my life. I want to be able to do that. And I'd only just been dabbling in theatre at that point, but that really turned my thinking to how can I create more of that for the rest of my life. And so that moment, that being on stage, being visible, being able to create that kind of a magic that impacts everybody, no matter who I talk to or what conversations I have, being able to create that kind of an impact where people walk out of there going, wow, I want that. That stuck with me my entire life. And it was what really started to give me my purpose and my why. So I could use the metaphor of that discovery of, the footlights, the stage, all of that. I could use all of that imagery, those words, that kind of thing, to create a metaphor for my own journey. Because for all of the characters in a chorus line, it's about the personal journey. It's about them discovering who they are and being vulnerable. That's actually the story of chorus line, understanding your journey and being comfortable with who you are. And so I think that being able to use something like that then as a metaphor or as a way to connect people to the bigger picture. And that's what metaphor does. It connects you to the bigger picture. And so the way that you can make it stick is you've got to create a metaphor that connects to the story that you're sharing. So, for instance, Sharon, when you and I got together in Melbourne, we talked about the metaphor of the mountain and all of the language around the mountain, all of that kind of stuff, and how that became a metaphor for your growth in your business and the challenges and all of that. And metaphors will stick when it's the right one to connect with your story. Often, if you use a metaphor that doesn't really work, it won't stick in your audience's mind. It's got to be one that connects really strongly to your story. And that can be a little bit of an art to find the right metaphor for your story and your vision and for what you want to share with the audience. So the way to make it stick is to make sure that it matches your story. It's got to have the same energy as your story. It's got to have the language that when you use it, it's just really, really easy to share. Deb's made a comment about that stories are important to us because they help us connect with each other and they prepare us for the future. They're a tool that enables us. Absolutely, I totally agree, Deb. I think the impact of stories. In fact, if you look, there's a whole heap of neuroscience out now around how stories affect our brains. And if you've seen any of my editions of my latest little newspaper that I put together, and it's curated content from all around the place, but I focus on presentation skills, speaking, and storytelling. And in the latest issue of that one last week, I think it was, I had a picture of our storytelling, our brains on storytelling and what happens. And when we tell stories, our brains release the trust chemical. Oxytocin, I think, is the right one. They release a trust chemical. So that's why when we're telling a story, we get this like an extraordinary connection with our audience when it's a story that really makes them kind of sit up and pay attention and makes their heart sing. It's because their brains are releasing this chemical, and they go into empathy with us. And that's how you create trust and rapport. Stories do that. Stories heal. You might tell a story and you're thinking, I have no idea why I'm telling the story, but for some reason, as you both know, and people listening to this call who've seen me in action know, I'm highly intuitive. And so stories just pop up for me to share. And at the time, I'm not quite sure why I'm sharing it, but it doesn't really matter. I'm sharing it anyway. And somebody in the audience needs to hear that. That somebody needs to hear and needs to be able to connect with an aspect of that story. And it creates healing, it creates trust, it creates rapport, and it gives the audience power. It gives the audience power to create their own stories because they are comfortable then with becoming a little more vulnerable. I hope that makes some sense to you. And Kate, I hope this helped answer your question about metaphor. Analogies, I think, is another thing that Kate mentioned. It's a little different. That's more like for like, and has more of a scientific bent to it. I don't use analogies as much. I use metaphor very much so in my storytelling. So are there any other questions or comments? Okay, Deb's asked, so where do you start when trying to find out your own story? Well, you're going to learn that because I'm going to give you my VIP access to Speaking Alchemy, and it's in the very first module. I think it's all second. Anyway, it's in the story component of the free course. But I will just give you a very quick overview of that. You do what I call a timeline. Now, as actors, we often prepare a timeline for ourselves so that we understand like what's happening to us as that character in that story. We do a timeline of events. So I would suggest that, and I expand on this in the course, but very briefly, if you can imagine a piece of string, okay, so that is your entire life right up until now, a piece of string. Okay, so that's your chronological timeline from birth to right now. And if you can imagine, so I think of that as one thread, but if you can imagine right throughout your life, there will be intersecting threads. And those intersecting threads are what I call turning points, times where maybe your life took on like a really different aspect, or you were suddenly, it could be something like your parents divorcing, or you moved home for the 10th time in 6 years, or anything. It could be anything. But if you actually sat down quietly, looked at your timeline and went, okay, well, at age 6, this happened. And then at 15, this happened. And you intersect your timeline with just draw a line down, a squiggly line, whatever you like, colored pens, doesn't really matter. But if you think of that, so we have those intersecting threads, and they're the turning points. So for me, the turning point, I have a couple when I was quite young, but the chorus line story that I was telling you about a moment ago, that was a massive turning point for me. Deciding to leave full-time work to become an actor, a professional actor, was a big turning point for me. So, and each one of those have created something different in my life. So they aren't always, big, like, woo, blow up in your face kind of turning points. They can often be quite subtle. So that's the first activity. And as I said, I have a little diagram for you and what it looks like, and I explain, well, I've just explained it all to you, so you'll be able to go ahead with that activity straight away. So the turning points is a really good way to start to work out which are the significant parts of the story, because there's going to be little bits, there's going to be tiny turning points, and there's going to be massive ones. Things like divorce and stuff like that are often massive turning points. They're not necessarily the most significant. For instance, Deb, I know that you write, so for you the turning point one of your turning points would definitely be the first time one of your plays was published, or even starting to write the first play. Why did you do that? So that would be a turning point in your life where you decided to, grab your pen and start to write. What made you do that? Has it been a common theme throughout your life? And you will find, and this is one way to find out the metaphor for your life as well, is is there any consistent theme? And I talk about this in the course as well. What are the consistent themes that come up? If you look at your timeline, you look at those intersecting threads. If you think of each one of those threads as being a different color or a different energy, or how you felt differently after it, are there any threads that feel the same? Was there a similar pull towards creativity or self-expression on some of those threads? Was there a familiar pull on some of those threads? Like, were you being tweaked in a particular direction by those threads? So think of it as like a fabric, a tapestry, because that's what our lives are, aren't they? So I'm mixing lots of metaphors at the moment. I'm talking about stage, I'm talking about fabric, but think of it as stage curtain, if you like. But it's the warp and the weft of the weave of your story. And when we weave those stories, we start to find that we have some particular threads that kind of pop up all the time, that kind of pull for our attention. And if we were to pull on those, we would start to discover some of our significant stories. Did you like that metaphor? Thank you for the comments. Yes, I've been creating that, and interestingly enough, I'm going to next month be doing a new photo shoot for myself, and we came up with the idea that I would use some fabric, because I've always loved fabric. I love the feel of it, I love textures, I love color, as you all know, and so we're going to do something with fabric in my photo shoot to create some lovely swirly energy. So for me, of course, orange, I love orange, and I've loved orange for a very long time. And so for me, that's all about self-expression and creativity. So that's been a fairly constant colored thread all the way through my life. Even from when I was really young, and my sisters and I, we would create little concerts that we would force my mum and dad to sit down and watch. And I loved creating them. I loved creating the actual content of the concert. So it's no wonder that I'm now, the speaker's director, is it really? If you think about some of those things that I used to do. So look to your hobbies. Look to your values, and they will help you discover some of your significant stories as well. Any other questions? Okay. So we don't have any other questions. I don't have any more questions from the people who are going to be listening to this. So I'm just going to ask, what else could I add that would actually make this feel rounded? Is there anything else I could add that would help?
When you're waiting to go on stage or
Yes.
to talk, and do you have any kind of little, I don't know, mantra or affirmation or visualization or anything you do just to kind of get yourself fully into the moment, so that when you step on, when you've got that microphone and the clicker and the spotlight's on you, you then go bang, straight
Bang,
into
I'm
it?
ready. I absolutely do. Fantastic question, and thank you for asking it. I'm also sharing this in the speaking program. How cool is that? So you're just picking my brain. I love it. Okay, so I have a mantra, and it's part of a series of mantras, and I explain all of them in the online course. The free course is part of the stage part of the modules, and it's called the center technique. So I'll share with you the one thing in that I use before I walk on stage. I breathe in for a count of 5. I breathe out for a count of 5. And as I'm doing that breathing, so it's kind of like a bit of a deep breathing exercise, because breathing well actually calms you down. So breathing well also, it's a great tranquilizer, if you like, for your brain. Deep breathing is a really great calming effect. So doing some deep breathing before you walk on is great. Just focusing on feeling your feet on the floor, feel the mic in your hand. Just use your senses to really ground yourself and be very present in your body, because what often happens, people get very nervous, and they then their brains kind of scoot off 100 miles an hour in different directions, and they're no longer physically present. So they're not present in their mind, they're not present in their bodies. So using your physical senses to really anchor yourself in the present moment is very, very important. The actual mantra I use is, I return with strength. And it's part of the center process, and it's like the last center, as in CENTER, American spelling, because the acronym works better for me that way. So the R is, I return with strength. And you breathe in for a count of 5. So it takes you 10 seconds to do, and you can repeat it like 6 times. It'll take you a minute. I return, breathing in on a count of 5. With strength, breathe out for a count of 5. Now, the reason you say that is that I teach this to actors and film and TV students, because they have multiple entrances and exits. In a stage play, they'll have to come on and off all the time. They've got to stay really focused. They've got to stay really present. And for film and TV, there's an awful lot of waiting around. There's a lot of, oh, the light's not quite right. Oh, a cloud just went over the sun. There's an aeroplane. I can hear a bird chirping in the background. Hang on a minute. We've just got to check the light. And there's lots and lots of hanging around. Lots of waiting for the technical aspects before you do your 1 minute of dialogue. So to be able to stay really focused and really present, I return with strength is about reminding yourself that you're strong, you're powerful, and you can do this. It's really simple. And it just, when you say return, it's like, okay, let's bring all of these scattered particles of my brain, wherever it's all disappeared to, let's bring it all together and be very present with what I'm doing. When you walk on stage in full presence, the audience can feel that. If your energy is scattered because you're worrying about the microphone, will they hear me? And most people have fairly poor microphone technique. And I get that I need to teach that as well. So I'll add it to my list. I'm writing myself a list here. And so when you're walking onto that stage, you're fully present. You anchor your physical energy in your hand around the microphone and in your feet on the stage, so that physically you're there, vocally you're there, you have vocal presence, you have physical presence, and the audience just have this beautiful sense of who you are as you walk out. I hope that helps you. You're on stage again next week. Fantastic, Sharon. I want you to go try that and let me know how you go.
I will definitely. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we're coming up to 10:15, and I'm feeling like we are probably have come to a natural end for this particular hangout. I'm really enjoying this, so I think I might do them quite regularly. What do you think? Would that be appealing?
That would be extremely appealing for me, and I wasn't quite too sure what to expect. Although I just was looking forward to hanging out with you, but next time I'll be a little bit more prepared with questions and ideas and thoughts and things.
Okay, so that's also really useful for me to know too. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure I said quite often, you know, if you have questions, you know, send them to me. But if I let people know that I'm doing it more regularly, then I think people would perhaps become more comfortable with actually asking a question, even if it's on paper, and I just talk to those questions prior to or during the session. And you know, that's really valuable as well, because you never know, when somebody asks a question, you don't know where it would lead. You know, the fact that Deb asked about how do I, you know, work out what my story is, you know, led me down that lovely path of sharing, you know, about the threads and the tapestry and how you can create that for yourself. And sometimes that shows up when I'm doing a speaking gig or creating a product or something, but sometimes it doesn't, because I create in that moment for that audience. You put different things in all the time, so it's useful to know what people need to hear from me. So thank you. And you love hanging out with me. I love that too. Love hanging out with you guys too. So this is really cool. So any last minute thoughts? And if I were to do this again sometime, maybe in the middle of November, would that be valuable?
Oh, absolutely. I'd definitely be here.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So if I'm thinking that maybe a monthly hangout could be quite fun.
That would be lots of fun.
Okay. All righty. And yes, I'm getting a resounding yes from Deb as well. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining me. And the recording is going to be available just as soon as I get the technology sorted, and I will email it to everyone who registered. And in terms of the online speaking course, I'll be drip feeding you the modules for that. There's 6 mini modules in it on story, stagecraft, and audience engagement. So there's a activity for each one of those, and you'll be getting those over the course of the next week. So the first one will come your way tomorrow, and then I think it works out that you'll get each module about every 3 days you'll get it. So over the next 2 weeks you'll have all 6 modules to play with, and so that will hopefully get you started in a very authentic way on your speaking journey as well. So thank you so much for hanging out with me, and I can't wait to catch up with you again in sometime in November. I'll let you know just as soon as I set some dates for some more hangouts.
That's awesome, Simone. Thank you so much. It's been great hanging out with you and Deb. It's just great to see you again, and looking forward to actually seeing you physically in a few weeks.
Yes, I know. That'll be great fun. Coming to Melbourne to do a couple of speaking events and also my workshop down there. So that'll be great fun. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too, and to the online. So thank you so much for doing this. I really, truly appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure. And Deb, thank you so much for your participation. Really loved having you on the call as well. And thank you to everybody listening into this now and in the future. Thank you so much for your contribution. It's wonderful to have you on board. Looking forward to catching up with you all again. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.